everyone. My name is Eryn Oelstrom, and today I'll be presenting my study on habitat use by raptors at Bolsa Chica Ecological Reserve as a model for estuary restoration. My mentor for this project was Kelly Elliott, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. Coastal wetlands are one of the most productive biomes that we have on this planet. They're extremely important because they help to conserve water resources. They can help prevent against land and soil erosion. They help protect us against storm and tidal surges, and they can also store atmospheric carbon dioxide. Most importantly, though, they help increase the biodiversity of the region that they're located in. Unfortunately, they're also one of our most threatened ecosystems on the planet, and in the last century, the globe has lost more than a quarter of its wetland ecosystems. More than 25% of species that rely on wetland ecosystems currently face extinction, and here in California, we have lost 90% of our coastal wetlands due to human development. Because of that, the remaining 10% of our coastal wetlands have been subject to increasing restoration and conservation efforts, including here at Bolsa Chica Ecological Reserve. So in 2006, 1.57 million cubic meters of material was excavated from Bolsa Chica Ecological Reserve in order to reintroduce the tidal flow to the wetlands. It was a $144 million project, and it was the largest of its kind in Southern California's history. And since 2003, between the combined efforts of organizations, students, and volunteers, more than 2 tons of invasive plants have been pulled from the reserve. Also, 5,000 native plants have been installed throughout the reserve, and currently, Bolsa Chica hosts 1,400 acres of protected habitat. You can find more than 230 different bird species there, including 23 species that are listed on the IUCN Red List. It's also home to a 25-year-long native plant restoration effort. So I chose to study raptors for a few reasons. First of all, they're generally considered an indicator species in the habitats that they're a part of, and this is due to their position as a predator or apex predator in the food webs that they're included within. I also included them because they have a massive diversity in their foraging strategies, their habitat use, and their prey preference. And finally, I included them because they're generally considered to be an umbrella species, which refers to the fact they have a large land area for their habitat. So protecting habitat for raptors inherently protects habitat for many other organisms that can use it. So for my study, I surveyed Bolsa Chica Ecological Reserve over the span of 4 months. I surveyed from December 2023 to March 2024, and I was looking for 5 distinct raptor species. The data that I collected involved species identification, behavioral observations, and the GPS data that was correlated to each observation. The target species for this study was the American kestrel. These guys can be found in any open or semi-open habitat. They are cavity nesters, and they hunt by observing from a high perch, and then they swoop down onto their prey from above. Next species I looked at was the Cooper Talk. These guys tend to live in forests, open woodlands, wood edges, and river groves. They nest in coniferous, deciduous, mixed wood areas with a moderate amount of clearings, and this is due to their hunting strategy. They prefer to perch in a densely covered area, and then they use bursts of speed and agility to take down their prey. The next species that I looked at was ospreys. These guys can be found near any water, fresh or salt, that you can find fish in. They build very large platform nests that are lined with sticks, branches, and other organic material. And their hunting strategy is to fly over the water, so they find a fish, then they hover over it, and then they plunge feet first to grab that fish with their talons. Kind of illustrated this picture down here. The red-tailed hawk is another species that I included. These guys have a really diverse set of habitats. You can find them in open country, woodlands, prairie, mountains, farmlands, and even in urban areas like cities. They tend to nest very high in trees, 35 to 40 feet off the ground, and they have bowler cup-shaped nests. Their hunting strategy is very similar to the American kestrel, where they prefer to perch up high and then swoop down onto their prey from above. The last species that I included in my study were the turkey vultures. These guys have the widest spread of habitat of all the species I looked at. You can find them in open country, desert, woods, foothills, farmlands, etc. They tend to nest on cliffs or other types of sheltered areas. Their hunting strategy is a little different. They use their excellent sense of smell in order to find carrion or dead organisms for them to eat. So for the behavioral analysis portion of my study, I took all of my observations and I categorized them into two different types of interactions. The first type of interaction that I looked at was intraspecific interactions, and that involves any type of interaction between two individuals of the same species. As you can see from this graph, the only three species I observed interacting with the same species is turkey vultures, red-tailed hawks, and ospreys. In the pink here, we are looking at interspecific interactions, and that involves any interactions between two individuals of different species. All of the study species were observed interacting with other species throughout the study period. For the next section for my behavioral analysis, I took all of my observations and I lumped them into categories by type. This first category is locomotion, so this involved any behaviors of hovering, kiting, soaring, gliding, or powered flight. All five study species were observed with some type of locomotion behavior, but we can see in the purple up there, the turkey vultures were observed in locomotion the most. Actually, turkey vultures were only observed in locomotion throughout the entire study period, and they won't be on any of the other behavior charts through this presentation. To give a quick intro for the legend here, the purple is the turkey vultures, the red is for the red-tailed hawk, blue is for the ospreys, green is for the trooper's hawk, and then yellow is the red. The next category I looked at was territorial and sexual displays. That involved any displays, whether it was perched or in flight, also any defensive or harassing behaviors towards the same or different species, as well as any vocalization displays. As you can see from this graph, all of the species except turkey vultures were observed with some type of territorial or sexual behavior. However, the red-tailed hawk was observed with these behaviors most often. As a quick side note for the nesting behaviors, this survey was conducted a little bit too early in the breeding season for most of these species to observe any breeding type behaviors. However, early on in the survey period, I found two resident breeding pairs of ospreys at their respective nests. So throughout the survey period, I did check on them a few times and was able to observe some nesting behaviors. These included nest occupation, nest construction, and also incubation. Self-care category, this only involved preening, and all species except the turkey vultures were observed doing self-care behaviors throughout the study. The last behavior type that I looked at was hunting. So this is going to involve prey search, capture, prey chase, and prey transport, as well as any feeding behaviors. All of the species except the turkey vulture were observed with these types of behaviors. However, we can see that the osprey was observed with these behaviors most often. So before I delve into the resource use analysis portion of my presentation, I want to take a quick minute and address the dietary specialization between the 5 species that I studied. Out of these 5 species, 2 of those species are known as dietary specialists, and those are going to be the osprey and the turkey vulture. Ospreys are obligate piscivores, meaning that they will only or almost only eat fish, and turkey vultures are obligate scavengers, meaning they will almost only eat carrion. The other 3 species that I included are considered to be dietary generalists. However, each of them have a really strong prey preference, as you can see from this chart. The American petrel, they have a strong preference for insects. They will occasionally eat mammals or reptiles, and very rarely will try to get another bird. However, Cooper's hawk, they much prefer to eat other birds. They will rarely eat sometimes eat mammals, and will very rarely eat reptiles and insects. Lastly, our red-tailed hawk, they have a very strong prey preference for small mammals. They will occasionally take birds or reptiles, and very rarely will look for carrion, generally in times of distress. As you can see from this chart, these dietary specializations kind of create a really well-balanced prey demand, and this is an important element of why these 5 species can coexist at home. For the next part of my resource use analysis, I divided Bolsa Chica into 6 distinct habitats: coastal sage scrub, grass scrub mix, marsh flats, dirt and gravel fields, infrastructure, and water. And then what I did was I took all of my GPS coordinates and I assigned them into each of these categories in order to determine if there were any species-wide trends in habitat use. The first habitat I looked at is coastal sage shrub. This habitat is characterized by moderate coverage of shrubs and some trees, also characterized by the presence of native plants like California sagebrush and bush sunflower. This was my second most productive habitat that I viewed at Bolsa Chica, and surprisingly, the most productive habitat that I viewed was the grass scrub mix. This habitat is characterized by meadow areas that have grasses and weeds, very little to no coverage of shrubs, and almost no native plants present in this habitat. So that's why I was quite surprised to see that this habitat had representatives from all 5 of the species that I surveyed throughout the period. The next habitat that I looked at is marsh flats. As you can see, it takes up a large portion of the reserve. This area is variable habitat that might be underwater after a strong tidal or storm surge. These are characterized by water-loving grasses and tall reeds. The only 2 species that I observed using this habitat were the red-tailed hawk and the turkey vultures. Dirt gravel fields, this represents all of the areas that contain oil infrastructure that exists at Bolsa Chica. A lot of it still has infrastructure there. Some of it is still being used, but most of this area is just dirt or gravel fields that have little to no vegetation at all. I was surprised to see that all of the species except osprey were observed in this habitat, and we can see that the red-tailed hawks were using this habitat quite often. The infrastructure category, this includes all of the land area over Pacific Coast Highway, as well as along Warner Avenue. I also included the parking lot areas for Bolsa Chica Conservancy and the wetlands, and some adjacent lots next to Pacific Coast Highway here. This habitat was totally dominated by the ospreys. However, Cooper's hawks and red-tailed hawks were observed here once each. The last category of habitat that I looked at is water, and this is just areas that are always or almost always underwater at Bolsa Chica, and the only 2 species I observed in this habitat was ospreys and turkey vultures. For the last portion of my study, I wanted to look at if any of these species were more or less adapted to the man-made infrastructure that exists and is still at Bolsa Chica. So to do this, I took all of my observation data that involved egg perching behaviors, and I separated it by substrate. So I looked at naturally occurring versus man-made substrate, and the results of that were that the American kestrel used naturally occurring substrate 90% of the time, only using man-made about 10%. The Cooper's hawks use naturally occurring substrates 43% of the time, only using man-made 57%. The red-tailed hawks use naturally occurring substrates 74% of the time, with only 26% on the man-made infrastructure, and ospreys were never observed on a naturally occurring perch. Throughout the entire study, they were only observed on man-made infrastructure while perching. The turkey vultures were not represented in this analysis because I never saw them perching throughout the entire study period, so I have no data for that. So in conclusion, the estuary ecosystems that have the most diverse habitats can support the widest variety of predators that are all in competition for the same resource. The dietary specialization of the 5 species that I looked at in my study is what helps to allow for them to coexist within Bolsa Chica Ecological Reserve. And the coastal sage shrub and grass scrub mixed habitats supported the widest variety of raptors. And lastly, some raptor species have actually adapted to the man-made elements that exist in their environment. Some have even started using it as a resource. So all of these elements combine to lead to a successfully restored estuary habitat. I hope that this study can exist as a guideline for future efforts to restore coastal wetlands in Southern California moving forward. There is my work cited, and I want to give a really big thank you to my mentor, Kelly Elliott, and also to Bolsa Chica Conservancy. And I want to thank all of you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed your presentation.